Okay, first off, Menno, thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview. I know you have a lot of stuff going on and you have a really busy schedule, so thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Before we start, could you give us a brief introduction on your background, how you got into fitness, and what you currently do as a profession?
Sure. I basically came into fitness from a completely different direction than a lot of people in the industry. I was a business consultant specialized in advanced statistical data analysis, an economist by education, and I came to realize that my career path was the one that was um, expected of me and not really what my passion was about. I'd always been interested in sports and strength training. I started at a really young age. And I developed that passion into online physique coaching, wrote articles. It went really well. And basically, I quit my job, made this my full-time thing. And now my main two things that I do are my online PT course, which is an educational course on the science and practice of bodybuilding, 6 months long. And secondly is coaching clients. I'm actually not sure how many clients I have, at least 30 at any given time. And I do online coaching for those. They're usually a bit more advanced, or at least they're very passionate and hardcore. Like if someone isn't training at least 3 times a week, I usually say, there are other coaches that can help you. Most my clients are interested in absolutely maximizing their results in the gym in terms of fat loss and muscle growth primarily, strength secondarily.
So what are your typical clients? Is it like powerlifters or it's more towards the physique kind of clients that you have?
There's quite a high variety, but if I had to name like the one client type that I have a few powerlifters. I have quite a lot of competitive physique athletes. But if there's like one type that I see most often in my inbox, it's like the intermediate that watches protein intake, knows how to track macros, and does strength training at least 3 times a week. And they basically stalled. They're sort of stuck in they made the newbie gains and that worked, but now they're stuck and they can't really take it to the intermediate/advanced levels.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what they want help with.
Yeah. Do you feel that your educational background has helped you with into
Sure.
reading the research and stuff?
Yeah, especially at Warwick, which is the university I attended to, which is like one of the best schools in the world. The level of education was absolutely stellar, and I met some of the brightest people that I've ever met there. I was very fortunate to have almost all my professors were like extremely inspirational people, and it was an education that was because it was strictly behavioral economics, but my professors were very research oriented. They were like, there aren't really any jobs in behavioral economics. So what we do is we train you for research. And we got statistics on a level that, well, fortunate for me, I had a very good background in statistics already, but the level of statistics that we got was actually quite insane. And there were lots of complaints about it for the education that we had. It was like we were doing a master in statistics in many ways.
Yeah.
And statistics and science are absolutely crucial to reading and interpreting research, and also just the way of thinking, the rational way of thinking. The whole Bayesian method, basically, that I'm known for, Bayesian bodybuilding, it comes from statistics and economics. The Bayesian way of thinking, which is named after a guy called Bayes, is basically doesn't exist anywhere except in economics and statistics, and now, funny enough, in bodybuilding.
Yeah.
So it's a small niche field, but that way of thinking is, well, it's now the fundament of my whole method.
Yeah, I think I remember when I first heard of Bayesian bodybuilding, I thought to myself, I've heard the word Bayesian before, but I couldn't remember where it was from. I remember it. So a couple of months later, I was checking something up in my statistics books, and I came over the phrase Bayesian. So that's where I connected the dots and understood where it came from.
Yeah, it must have been like a statistics or economics book.
Yeah.
Never see the term.
Okay, Menno. The topic for today is how you should change your training as you get more advanced. And I wanted to start first by, if we could define what's a beginner, what's a novice, and what's an advanced person in regards to training.
That's a really good question. Because, and I like the general theme as well. Basically, what you often see online is people that define how advanced you are in one of two ways. You have the powerlifter kind of guys, like Ripito and many other powerlifters. They basically say, if you can bench this much, you are intermediate. If you can bench this much, you're advanced. That's okay. I'll get to my way after the second way. But the second way is that they say, and researchers often use this, they say, if you've been training for this amount of time, you're a novice, this amount of time, you're intermediate. After 2 years, you're intermediate. The problem with that way is that you can spend 10 years in the gym entirely unproductively. And this is also what I see in tons of my clients. If I would perform a regression analysis, like I would relate training age to how advanced you are, like how, which is what I think it should be, how close you are to your genetic limits, then there is almost no relation, because so many people get stuck in a certain routine. They do that routine for 2 years, no results whatsoever. They don't get any more advanced in the way that you want to convey when you're thinking about this. So strength is a good indication, but you need to relate it to your genetic limits. And I have an article on that, so I won't go into it too much. On my website, like predicting muscular potential, there are many ways to do it. You can look at someone's frame size, how many androgenic traits they have. So if they, the typical easy gainer has like a very masculine build, broad jaws, big hands, sturdy frame. It's not just that it's biomechanically advantageous for powerlifting. It's also that having a big skeletal frame, it's like hanging your clothes onto a rack. If the rack is big, you can hang more clothes onto it. It works exactly that way with muscle mass and bone. I think there are even some estimates. There was some researcher that said like every kilo of bone can support 5 kilo of muscle or something. But the point is that you want to look at someone's indicators of genetic potential and relate that to how big or how strong they currently are. So you can have a genetic freak. I think it's Andy Bolton that he was like, I can't do his accent, but the first time I stepped into the gym, it was like, lads in the gym thought I had lifted before because I squatted 400 pounds. Yeah, obviously they do, because that guy, the first time he stepped into the gym, he squatted more than many people will ever squat. And then can you say he is advanced? Of course not. He was at the beginning of his career. So that's like the extreme example of an extreme genetic freak. On the other hand, you have the super hard gainers who actually think they're still novices because they're not that strong, because they just lucked out on the genetic lottery, and they need a lot more advanced program to get to a level that many people would consider intermediate because they have better genetics.
Yeah. And you also see that a lot in research, that you can put basically a bunch of people on the same training program, and some people would make like huge gains, and in some studies you actually see that people lose muscle mass as well doing the same routine. And
exactly.
One thing that I notice is that it's very difficult when you ask a client that what would you consider yourself, beginner, novice, or advanced, because people would only answer that question based on how many years they have trained. And some people have maybe trained for 10 years, but it's not been an optimal training program they have been following.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because asking people would be one way to do it. But you get what you say, and two factors that I notice a lot is like the sort of humble brag, or just being excessively humble. I've had competitors, they've done multiple competitions, and they say, given that I'm at the intermediate level, dude, you are not at the intermediate level. You've competed internationally. That's just being humble.
Yeah.
And other people are like, they think they read a lot online, but they haven't progressed that much in the gym. So they're like, yeah, I'm pretty advanced. And they try all these super advanced training methods. And I'm like, you don't need to do any of that. You should just be focusing on getting bigger all over.
Yeah, just the basic stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
funny you mentioned that because you know Carl Ingvar Christensen, Norwegian powerlifter.
I think I've heard of her. Yeah.
Yeah, he was on a TV program in Norway, and he just basically said that I don't have any special skills. I'm just a normal guy, and the guy squats almost 500 kilograms, so it's like insane. So you see,
Yeah.
I see that also with a lot of clients that the people that are at the advanced level tend to be more humble, if you can say that, and people
Yeah.
that aren't near the advanced level usually think that they are more advanced than they really are.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That-
yeah,
It's like Dunning-Kruger law.
yeah,
Those.
yeah, exactly. So what do you feel like, for instance, if we have a person that he started weight training and he's past the beginner's level and into the novice level, intermediate, what do you feel is the biggest mistake that people do when they get to that level and can't advance further to the advanced level?
Mhm. Biggest mistake. Okay. That's tricky. I'll start with answering the question more generally. What should change in your program as you get more advanced? And then we can match that up with what people usually do.
Yeah,
So take a completely untrained person. And I think, by the way, this is like one of the most important things that I think is so underrated in the fitness industry, that many coaches don't use different programs for beginners and advanced trainees, or that it's just like intuitive. For example, they think that a technique that sounds advanced or that's more complicated is for some reason more advanced and should be something that advanced trainees should do. But it's just more complicated or more less conventional, and not necessarily there isn't a physiological basis for that technique being an advanced technique. So for example, myo reps might be a good example. Myo reps are, I think you're going to talk about this tomorrow or soon, are known as an advanced technique generally. But I wouldn't say that myo reps are something that should be used exclusively by advanced trainees or at all. But you'll go into that later.
yeah,
So you've got an untrained individual. What separates this individual from someone who is a lot more advanced? First, levels of muscle activation are not nearly as high because of the neural adaptations that occur with training. The more advanced you get, the stronger you get, the better the nervous system becomes at recruiting muscle tissue, which means that muscle activation levels are a lot higher. With respect to intensity, this means that more advanced trainees generally benefit from higher intensities a lot more than beginners. And there was a lot of research showing that the benefits of going beyond about 60% for a beginner has very few benefits in terms of size and even very little benefits in terms of strength, because beginners simply they cannot recruit muscle tissue as effectively as advanced trainees. You also see this in the gym. Advanced trainees, a 1RM attempt, that's super draining. That's one of the hardest things you can do in the gym. A 1RM deadlift or a 1RM squat, it takes everything you've got. Beginners, not nearly as much. If you have them do a 1RM, it's a lot like any other set because they cannot reach that all. They cannot give it their all, basically. So in general, I'd say that the more advanced you get, and you also see this in research, in trends at least, that more advanced you get, the higher the average training intensity you should use becomes. And as for the research, I think where a lot of people get stuck in that the current evidence-based fitness industry is often defined by what I call nihilism, basically meaning that if there's not a study showing this, like a randomized controlled trial, hardcore supporting this, then it's not true. And that is a scientific way of thinking. But in fitness, we have so little research compared to, say, psychology, that this mindset is really not very helpful in many topics where we simply do not have a lot of research at all. So what you need to prove something like this, and why it will take a lot of time before this will reach scientific consensus, I think, is you need first to show the benefits of an intensity. So you need two groups, high and low intensity, and this in itself is already tricky. So you need two groups, one in low intensity, one in high intensity. Then you need this design for untrained individuals and more trained individuals, which means you already have 4 study groups. Now you need to show the main effect of intensity in both groups, and you need to show an interaction effect between the 4 groups, which means that you need a ridiculously large sample size and an overall very, very good study design and a lot of funding. So it's going to take a while before you see this in a scientific peer-reviewed paper, probably.
So
as for volume,
Brad's not going to do it next year, okay?
If we get Brad on it, it might be next month. But in terms of volume, it's largely the same. As an untrained individual, you are very susceptible to muscle damage because the repeated bout effect has not occurred yet. So, which is also what you see in the gym. Someone is untrained, they go to the gym for the first time, they are sore as hell. And the more advanced you get, in general, the less sore you get, unless you're specifically doing things in the gym that make you sore, which is what a lot of people do. But so they are a lot more protected against muscle damage, and for that reason, they can generally tolerate a much higher training volume. We do, by the way, have these trends in the research by the meta-analysis by Rhea et al. And Wernbaum also at least suggested a similar thing. He didn't do the meta-analysis, but based on his narrative review, he did say that more advanced trainees probably need more volume. So in general, you got more volume, more intensity, and also more frequency. And this is really interesting because here we actually have 3 lines of research that show this. We know that the anabolic window, which is really a very long time period where protein synthesis can be increased more than regularly after a training session. So you go to the gym, and as an untrained individual, it can be more than 72 hours after that session, the protein synthesis can be elevated more, because this is the process of building new muscle tissue. There's actually, I think Body Power is going to post my lecture for the Epic Fitness Summit on this, where I go into frequency on a lot of detail. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but the brief version is that you see this window of anabolic opportunity. What most people think is like this 2-hour window, but it's really the whole process of building muscle. This shortens, so you have that line of research showing that this muscle protein synthesis bout, this spike, shortens after a training session. Even if you increase volume, by the way, because some people say it's just the volume, it's not the frequency. But researchers have actually tried this. A lot of studies done by the lab of Stuart Phillips, for example. Even if you increase volume over the training program, you still see this reduction in the time of the anabolic window. We also see this in muscle damage, studies on recovery, where more advanced trainees are more resistant against muscle damage and overall neuromuscular fatigue. So the period of recovery is reduced. Again, means that when you are recovered and supercompensation has occurred, like general adaptation syndrome, you should be training again. So that's another line. And we also see it in the research. If you look at the research on untrained individuals, there are many studies showing no benefits at all of training more than once a week. In more advanced trainees, the trends are very, very clear. You should be familiar with the Norwegian Frequency Project, for example, which is by far the best data on highly trained lifters that we have on this. Basically, they compared 6 versus 3 times a week, exact same program, exact same intensities, same exercises, same volume, same everything. So it was basically 3 full body sessions compared to 6. And this basically made the difference in these advanced trainees of stagnation and very good progress. So in all of these ways, and I think these are the most important ways, there are also differences with like rest intervals that I discussed in my publication on this in SportsMed, together with Brad Schoenfeld, that more advanced trainees generally need more rest between sets. But most of these things point to the more advanced you get, the more specific and the more aggressive the stimulus that you need to build further muscle tissue. What you did to get out of the newbie zone, basically, it doesn't cut it anymore. So you need you need to train smarter and harder to get to the next level. And a lot of people, they get stuck for example, you have the bro kind of client. Basically, what they get stuck on is training once a week, completely annihilating a muscle group and then letting it recover for about a week, and not using high intensities. And generally they do use a high volume, but given that the frequency is so low, it may not be sufficient anymore to cause meaningful adaptations. So they get stuck into that kind of program, and that works well as long as they are newbies, because newbies, they don't need high intensities, they don't need the high training frequency. So as long as they don't completely overdo it on the training volume and go Arnold Schwarzeneggerian routine, they should be fine during the novice period. But when they try to keep doing that, they won't make it to the more advanced level, or it goes really slow. On that last topic, I think that a lot of people say you have these diminishing returns effects, and optimal program design, it may advance your rate of progress, but it won't. You get these 5% differences or something they pull from a research study. But in my experience, and what you also see in these studies like the Norwegian Frequency Project, we also have threshold effects, as they're called in statistics, where there should be a certain threshold that needs to be reached before any kind of adaptation occurs in the body. And this makes perfect sense. If you're quite an advanced trainee, the body needs to have a very specific stimulus to reach the point where it actually builds more muscle tissue. Like, it's very easy to maintain muscle tissue. It's quite hard to actually lose a lot of muscle mass, especially if you're doing any kind of training. But gaining it is a lot more difficult. So I think it's not just the case that these things can make the difference between 80 and 85% progress, but in many cases, they can make the difference between progress and no progress. Does that answer your question?
That answered my question. I understand that you are more into the higher frequency. So do you use higher frequency more with the advanced clients that you have, or is it generally that you use a higher frequency? Like, what's the range of frequency that you use with your clients?
Yeah, so interestingly, my programs for beginners look a lot like bro splits. Mm-hmm. They don't have a high frequency. I do make sure that muscle groups, based on my muscle-specific hypertrophy articles, that you hit muscles with different functions in different ways, so that you stimulate the muscle, all the muscle fibers, basically, which is also what bros do. And from there, as they get more advanced, I increase frequency, volume, and intensity. So it becomes a lot more like, for example, how the national powerlifting team in Norway currently trains. And that progresses as they get more advanced and they get stuck on the more simple routines.
Okay. When we're talking about this topic, exercise selection, you have some great articles on exercise selection, and you have also some principles in regards to what exercises you should select if your goal is to maximize hypertrophy. Could you briefly mention that?
Sure. I have, I think the article is called 7 Principles of Exercise Selection. I think in my PT course I now have 10, but the most important ones are still in that article, which I think you can find it on T-Nation, Simply Shredded, and JMax Fitness. Probably some other sites do. But basically, the principles are going by heart, specificity, basically, or the limit factor. You need to target a muscle group specifically. So if a muscle is not a limiting factor in the performance of an exercise, it's not a really good exercise, which is like for overhead squats. It's really the shoulders, not the legs, that are often limiting you. So you don't see, I don't see overhead squats really as a kind of squat. It's more like an overhead press. It's in that kind of category. Very important principles are range of motion, that I also have a separate article on the blog of Brad Contreras. Full versus partial range of motion, or both, I think it's called. And there I basically show that full range of motion just almost always dominates partial range of motion in every regard. And even if you mix full and partial range of motions, the trend in the research is still currently that just always using full range of motion is better. Principle that is a lot trickier to understand is matching resistance curves to your strength curve, which means that throughout the exercise, you should always feel that you can produce maximal muscle tension and stimulate the muscle well. For example, if you're doing a dumbbell curl and you're in the bottom position, your arm is stretched out and there is actually almost no tension on the biceps because gravity is pulling the weight straight down. That's your traps are currently resisting gravity, not your biceps. As you lift the weight, it becomes heavier and heavier because the lever arm increases, and at about 90 degrees, it's really hard. So that's an exercise with a relatively poor resistance curve given your strength curve. If you do, I have an article on the Bayesian Curl, which is basically a cable curl where you stand facing away from the cable station instead of towards it, as most people do it. And then the resistance curve is a lot better because in the bottom position, which is really important, it's the position where the muscle is stretched. You also have good resistance, and it's a lot more equalized throughout the whole range of motion, so that over the whole part of the muscle that you are training, you actually have high levels of tension and muscle activity. Other important principles. And you see, you have microloadability. You can read up on that in the article. It's kind of more of a practical thing. Kinetic chains. You can also read up on that. It can take up a lot of time to explain that. I think those are the most important principles.
I understand you're not a big fan of conventional deadlift as a back exercise for muscle growth. Could you just briefly explain why you don't feel that that's a good exercise?
Yeah. Well, first, let me say, most people, when I say it's not an optimal exercise, they're like, oh, Menno say you can get big on deadlifts. I'm saying you can get bigger using a very specific targeted exercise selection than someone just doing deadlift. So it's not that deadlifts don't work. It's that an other selection can work better if you are a bodybuilder and you are not training the deadlift to get better at deadlifting. Well, the problems that you have with the deadlift for building mass are, first of all, the range of motion is arbitrarily determined by the radius of the weight plate because the weight starts on the floor, right? So you're not using full range of motion for any muscle group, in fact, that you're training. Secondly, you are only doing the concentric, or at least only doing a partial eccentric. You are lifting up the weight and then dropping it down, or you can lower it under control somewhat, but it's actually quite injurious to try to control the last part of the deadlift, the bottom part. So that may not even be wise to do.
So no slow burn there.
Yeah, exactly. no go for slow burn.
No go for slow burn.
So, I think deadlifts Fred will probably say that you can actually do it, and you probably can, but it's hell to do very, very slow deadlifts.
Yeah.
It's really, it's hell.
Yeah.
But so what would you want to do? You want to increase the range of motion and you want to incorporate the eccentric component. Well, then you basically have the Romanian deadlift. Now you have full range of motion for the glutes and the hamstrings. You have an eccentric and it's a dynamic exercise, dynamic contraction. So that's great. I'm a big fan of Romanian deadlifts. Basically, you just take out the quads of the movement because the quads it's a very poor exercise for the quads anyway. Range of motion is extremely poor. Tension is high only at the beginning of the lift, basically, not at lockout at all. And for the traps and back, it's not that great anyway. For the erector spinae, the erectors on your back that keep your back upright, it's okay because often you don't want to train those with a full range of motion anyway, depending on how susceptible you are to back injuries. You generally want to play it safe with the spine because the spinal injury is one of the worst things that can happen in your training career. But for the traps, you have other exercises like shrugs, ideally overhead shrugs, by the way. But you can do shrugs, anything which will have a full range of motion and is more targeted towards that muscle group. So basically, the deadlift, conventional deadlift, powerlift deadlift, is a great jack of all trades exercise. if the hypothetical, you can only do one exercise, I guess deadlifts would be an okay choice because it targets a lot of muscle groups, but it's not optimal for any single one of them.
Yeah.
So it's very time efficient. If you're a powerlifter, you need to train it. But if you're a bodybuilder looking for maximum hypertrophy, my position is that an alternative exercise selection, which is optimized for each individual muscle group, will achieve greater rates of muscle growth.
Okay. Thank you so much. I have a last question. Should anything be changed in regards to nutrition as you get more advanced? For example, should you eat more calories as you get more advanced to build more muscle, or increase your protein even more to gain more muscle? Do you have any input on that?
Sure, yeah. What happens to your calories depends. Often, once you make it to the advanced level, you will indeed be eating more calories because your training volume will be higher. Your training loads are also higher. So even given the same amount of sets, you will be burning more calories, most likely. And your body mass should be a lot higher. So, which can make a few hundred calories difference in your metabolic rate, even if you're resting. Not to mention, the more active you are, the more pronounced this difference becomes.
Yeah.
So what happens to your calories depends.
Let me rephrase that. Like, I was thinking more of your calorie surplus in percentage. Is it more advantageous to have a higher surplus when you're more advanced, or should that surplus be lower compared to when you're a beginner?
Because when you're a beginner, your rate of muscle growth is going to be so much higher that you can use all those extra calories. But once you are more advanced, it's simply not going to happen anymore. So you can only use a small surplus, and using a very large surplus, which is also one of those things that beginners get stuck on, using too large deficits, too large calorie surpluses. So basically they get too fat during the bulk period, then they have to cut too hard, too aggressively, lose all that muscle mass, and basically they're just yo-yoing around a certain body composition. So definitely lower. You also asked about protein. I don't really recommend decreasing your protein intake just to be safe, but actually protein intakes are quite conclusively shown in research that they decrease because just like for calories, you are building less muscle mass, which means there is less protein synthesis, which means you need less protein. Also, the body, which comes back to what I said about the body becoming more resistant to muscle damage, we actually see that there is less protein breakdown during exercise in more advanced trainees. And for this reason as well, so on both sides of the equation of protein balance, you see you need less protein. You need less protein to cover up the damage that you do, and you need less protein because you aren't building as much new protein, because protein is one of the vital components of muscle tissue. And interestingly, one thing that I also do is when the training frequency increases and you get more advanced, I shift a lot of the calories more towards the workout period. So it's become this, people have swung the pendulum from workout nutrition is like the most important thing ever. If you're not drinking your whey shake with Gatorade right after your workout, then, say goodbye to your gains. It's not going to happen. And that pendulum swung with some very tentative research, especially after the meta-analysis from Alan Aragon and Brad Schoenfeld. And then people were like, they never read the discussion of the paper, of course. They were like, okay, it doesn't matter. Nutrient timing of any kind does not matter. It has, by this, been debunked. I think that as an untrained individual, it is indeed largely the case that how you time your nutrition in relation to your workout, because your anabolic window is so long, doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
As you get more advanced, however, it starts to matter. And I think this explains also what a lot of coaches experience, that actually I think, which is funny, I'm not 100% sure on this. I think Alan, Brad, Eric, Lane, and John Meadows all have their clients, insofar as they have them or themselves, still apply workout nutrition. So this idea that, it's been debunked, nobody does this anymore, it's been taken into question, but almost all the top coaches still do it. Berge Fagerli also, me also. So there is a discrepancy between what might theoretically be the case and what the current practice, the current recommendations still are.
I think a lot of people misunderstand it. Like they think that, oh, it's not that critical to do it like 10 minutes after your exercise. But if you want to do it, it's not a problem if you want to do it. It's not like you're going to lose your gains if you actually do it. But I think one thing that was good about the meta-analysis that came from Aragon and Schoenfeld was that people maybe got a little less obsessed with having to take their protein shake around the gym and then gulp it down as soon as the last set was finished. But I totally agree with you that nutrient timing has its place, especially when you are training advanced people. Like I actually do the same with my clients, that we have a lot more calories around the workout, both before the workout and after the workout. We center the calories around the workouts, basically.
Yeah, exactly. I think you hit the nail on the head there. This idea of the anabolic window. Also, I wrote an article on my site about specifically the idea that there is an anabolic window, like before 1 hour and 1 hour after your session, and that's the period. That indeed doesn't exist. It's the whole process, and you're talking usually about hours. It's not about how quickly after your last set you slam down the protein shake, if you even use a protein shake, because almost none of my clients do. It's not about how quickly you slam down the shake. It's about how sandwiched the workout session is in terms of nutrients being in the blood between meals. So, how long before the workout was the pre-workout meal? What composition had that? Fiber intake, fat intake. Was there sufficient protein? All of those matter how relevant it is to consume a post-workout meal immediately or close after your workout.
Yeah, I think a lot of people also forget that if you eat something 2 hours before a workout, those nutrients might be just starting to circulate in your system as soon as you finish your workout. It's not like that a chicken breast or a steak just goes through your system and you end up in a catabolic state right away. So
it's funny because people use whey that because they had the idea that the anabolic window was like an hour. But I think even in terms of pure whey consumed when you are fasted, it generally takes about an hour before amino acid levels actually peak in the blood.
Yeah.
So you still have that 1 hour period. If you slam it down right after, it's still going to take an hour.
Yeah, exactly. So
yeah.
Okay, Menno. Once again, thank you so much for taking the time after your busy schedule to do this interview.
No problem.
If people want to read more of your articles and learn more about the Bayesian method, is there any place they can visit on the web?
The one and only BayesianBodybuilding.com.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much, Menno.
Right, my pleasure.
Yeah.